Hello there and welcome. In this video, I'm going to show you how I do a full brake fluid change in my 2011 Nissan Frontier. I'll show you how I do the change with all four wheels on the ground and without lifting the truck or removing any tires. You heard that right, the truck stays on the ground the entire time. Plus, I'll show you how I'm able to do the job completely by myself. So stick around and you'll see just how easy it is. Alright, so here's the tools and supplies that I'll be using for the job, and there's not a whole lot to the supplies and tools. I use a 10mm open end wrench, about 3 pints of .3 brake fluid, and here I'm going to be using the super heavy duty OEM brake fluid from Nissan, a turkey baster for removing the old fluid from the master cylinder reservoir, and a brake fluid bleeder for receiving the old fluid as it purges from the brake calipers. Now before we get started, there's two things I want to show you. First, I want to talk a little bit more about the brake fluid bleeder. This is a tool that enables you to do this job by yourself, and it's very simple. You can make one yourself with a bottle and the right diameter tubing, and there's actually other videos on YouTube that can show you how to make a homemade version of this tool if you want. I was going to make my own, but when I went to buy the tubing, it wasn't much cheaper than buying the whole tool, so I just bought the tool instead. This particular brake fluid bleeder has a magnet attached to it, which is really handy, as you'll see. Now the way this whole thing works is that you connect one end of the tubing to the bleeder valve and the other end goes inside the bottle all the way to the bottom. For it to work properly, you need to put a little bit of brake fluid in the bottom, just enough to submerge the end of the tube. As you pump the brakes, the fluid will push the air out of the tubing and essentially you'll end up with an airtight siphon. And each time you pump the brakes, fluid will come out, but air won't be able to go back in. Now I had a hard time believing that this thing would actually work, but as you'll see in the video, it works great. The second thing I want to show you is the order that I use for this bleed. Now there's conflicting information out there about the order that this should be done in. On some of the forums that I read, the order is one way, and in the Haynes manual that I have for this truck, it says to do it a different way, and then the conventional wisdom that's out there says to do it another way. But shown here is the way that I did it, and since this is a maintenance bleed, the order I used isn't critical to me, but if I had done major work like replacing the master cylinder and had introduced considerable amounts of air into the system, I would have contacted Nissan to find out the exact order for purging all of the air out of the system. The good news is that the mechanics and the physical process of bleeding each caliper doesn't change based on the order that's used. With that, let's roll over to the truck and get started. First step in the process is to open up the hood and locate the brake master cylinder reservoir. It's located on the driver's side and toward the back of the engine bay. This is where the brake fluid gets added in the top and where I'll be checking the level of the brake fluid during the entire change. On the side of the reservoir, there's a minimum and maximum level indicator. The brake fluid level needs to stay above the minimum level during the entire brake fluid change to make sure that air doesn't get introduced during the process. Next, I'm going to wrap an old shirt or rag around the reservoir, and this is to catch any brake fluid that might spill while I'm removing the old fluid or while I'm adding new fluid. Brake fluid can damage paint, so I definitely don't want to let any of it spill on paint. Next, I'll remove the reservoir lid and filter screen that's in the opening, and I'll use the turkey baster to remove as much of the old fluid as I can. As you can see, the fluid coming out is pretty dark, and it takes several rounds with the turkey baster before I can get to the point where I can't remove any more. I make sure to keep the fluid level above the minimum level at all times, and then I'll fill the reservoir with new fluid, put the filter screen back in the reservoir, and put the cap back on the reservoir. This process of removing the old fluid and filling the reservoir with new fluid reduces the amount of old fluid and potential debris that gets pushed through the brake lines, and it helps introduce as much clean fluid as possible into the brake lines to replace the old fluid. Now throughout the fluid change, I'll need to add more fluid to the reservoir to keep it from dropping below the low level. And each time I'll be taking the cap off, pouring fluid in, and then reinstalling the cap. The first caliper that I'm going to bleed is the rear passenger side, and I'll show you where the bleeder valve is located. The calipers on the rear wheels are located toward the front of the truck. Here's the caliper, and the bleeder valve is on the top of the caliper and pointing toward the front of the truck. The bleeder valve should have a little black rubber cap on it. Now I've got the brake fluid bleeder tool filled with a little bit of fluid and ready to go. I'll start by removing the little rubber cap on the bleeder valve, and this proved to be a little challenging since these have never been removed on my truck. Then I install the brake fluid bleeder, and the little magnet that's attached to mine is really handy for attaching the bottle to the truck near the caliper. Once the tubing is connected to the bleeder valve, I use the 10mm open-ended wrench to loosen the valve. For my truck, you turn these counterclockwise to loosen the valve. Now you see that there's a little bit of fluid already starting to enter the tubing. The next step is for me to go to the cab of the truck and start pumping the brakes. Now I'm fast forwarding through this, but what's going on here in the background is that I'm going through a cycle of pumping the brake pedal in the cab several times, then checking the tubing to see how clean the fluid that's coming out is, and I'm checking the fluid level in the master cylinder reservoir and adding fluid as needed. In the background here, I'm repeating this process several times until the fluid in the tubing looks like new fluid, and after the fluid that's coming out looks good, I'll retighten the bleeder valve until it's tight. Then I disconnect the tubing from the brake bleeder valve and turn the tubing up so that it drains into the bottle and not onto the ground. And I'll reinstall the rubber cap on the bleeder valve and double check that the bleeder valve is nice and tight. All right, the second location I'll bleed is the rear driver's side. And as you can see, the rear driver's side is pretty much a mirror image of the rear passenger side. The bleeder valve is on top of the caliper and towards the front of the truck. I remove the rubber cap on the bleeder valve, install the tubing on the bleeder valve, and then loosen the valve a little bit. I then go through that cycle of pumping the brakes, checking the color of the fluid bleeding out, and managing the fluid level in the master cylinder reservoir. Once the fluid coming out looks new, I retighten the bleeder valve, remove the tubing in the bottle, and then put the rubber cap back on the bleeder valve, and then double check that the bleeder valve is tight. Now we'll move on to the front wheels. I'm going to do the front passenger side first. The calipers on the front wheels are on the side of the wheel that's toward the back of the truck. Here is the location of the caliper and the bleeder valve. Just like on the back calipers, the bleeder valve is on the top of the caliper, but in this case it's facing the back of the truck. The great thing about the front wheels is that you can actually turn them so that you can create a little bit more room for working. Since the caliper is on the back side of the wheel, for the passenger side, I'll turn the wheel like I'm going to make a hard left turn, and that'll create a little bit more space to work. Now I'm ready to bleed this one. Just like on the back wheels, I'll start by removing the rubber cap on the bleeder valve. I'll install the tubing, and then I'll open the bleeder valve slightly. Next, I'll cycle through that process of pumping the brakes several times, checking the color of the fluid that's bleeding out, and also managing the brake fluid level in the master cylinder reservoir, adding fluid when I need to keep it from dropping too low. Once the color of the fluid is good, I'll tighten the bleeder valve, remove the brake fluid bleeder bottle and tubing, reinstall the rubber cap on the bleeder valve, and double check that the bleeder valve is tightened down. The last caliper to tackle is the front driver's side. You'll recognize that the driver's side is identical in the mirror of the passenger side. Here's the caliper with the bleeder valve on top and facing toward the back of the truck. I'm going to turn the wheel for the driver's side to create some extra space. And for the driver's side, I'm turning the wheels like I'm making a hard right turn. Again, I'll start this process by removing the rubber cap on the bleeder valve. I'll install the tubing and bottle, and then I'll open the bleeder valve slightly. Then I'll cycle through that same process of pumping the brakes, checking the color of the fluid bleeding out, and refilling the master cylinder reservoir as needed. Once the color of the fluid is good, I'll tighten the bleeder valve, remove the hose and bottle, reinstall the rubber cap, and double check that the bleeder valve is tight. I want to mention here that as I've been bleeding each caliper, I've been removing some of the old brake fluid from the brake fluid bleeder bottle to keep it from filling up completely. Each time I've removed some fluid, I made sure to leave about an inch or so of fluid in the bottom of the bottle so that it will work properly. The last thing that I'm going to do here is double check the fluid level in the master cylinder reservoir to make sure that I'm close to the maximum line. And I am. I use pretty much all 3 pints of the fluid, and I tend to flush more than is probably necessary through each line, but the brake fluid isn't that expensive, and I wanted to make sure that I got a good flush in. To wrap things up, I wanted to show you a side-by-side comparison of the fluids. On the left-hand side is the new OEM fluid, which as you can see is pretty much transparent. And on the right-hand side, here is the used fluid. It's got more of an amber appearance. Now, I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit this, but this is the first time that I've changed the brake fluid in my truck. So the fluid shown here has about 193,000 miles on it. So it's fair to say that this is pretty used. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching the video. If you found it helpful, please consider liking and/or subscribing to the channel. In either case, thanks again and happy frontiering.